Habitat 67 is an apartment complex which is basically a physical mountain of 354 interlocking concrete boxes, and it's one of the most compelling paradoxes in modern housing history. Born from the mind of a 23-year-old university student, this radical complex was commissioned by the Canadian government to solve a crisis that still plagues many cities today: how to build high-quality, high-density housing that regular, working-class families can actually afford. But the visionary didn't stop with that. This concept was intended to replace those bleak, repetitive apartment towers we've seen in communist countries with a human-centric community, perhaps summarized best by the simple yet profound motto behind the project, which reads, "For everyone, a garden." But here's the thing: when we trace this story from a student's thesis to the brutal financial structural reality of the real world, it turns out that most people really can't have gardens. Yet, despite the facts, one city in Canada actually attempted to build a housing estate in keeping with this student's thesis. And well, the results are rather controversial. So what's the story behind this unusual project? And why can't every city dweller have their own garden? Stay tuned to find out as we explore the history of Habitat 67. I'm your host, Ryan Socash, and you're watching It's History. This story begins in 1961 at McGill University in Montreal, where an architecture student named Moshe Safdie was preparing his undergrad thesis. Traveling across North America, Safdie observed a depressing trend in urban development. City dwellers faced a miserable choice. They could live in cramped, dark, expensive downtown high-rises with zero access to nature, or they could flee to the sprawling suburbs, sacrificing hours of their life to traffic and gridlock in the process. A reality that led the student to ask himself some rather honest questions. He wondered, could you combine the best of both worlds? Could you take the main benefits of a suburban house, privacy, fresh air, natural light, and a personal yard, and stack them into a high-density urban apartment building? He thought so much about these questions that they led him to his thesis, titled A Case for City Living. The thesis outlined a radical blueprint. Instead of a flat tower where residents were sealed inside identical concrete shelves, he proposed an alternative modular system. To accomplish this, he designed standardized, prefabricated concrete boxes that could be mass manufactured on an assembly line like a car. From there, these boxes would be stacked in geometric, pyramid-like shapes. By shifting each box over the top of another, the roof of one apartment naturally became a massive, open-air terrace garden for the apartment above it. Because the units were staggered, every single home also enjoyed natural light from three sides, cross-ventilation, and a private piece of the sky. Now, conventionally, a student thesis typically stays on paper, but in this case, the stars aligned for something much more. Canada was preparing to host Expo 67, a massive World's Fair timed to celebrate the nation's 100th birthday. The theme of the exhibition was Man and His World, and organizers were searching for a flagship pavilion that would showcase Canada as a bold leader in innovation. Safdie's former thesis advisor happened to be working on the master plan of the expo and showed the young graduate's design to the organizers. Surprisingly, the Canadian government was captivated. Hence, at just 25 years old, with zero professional buildings to his name, Moshe Safdie was officially hired to turn his project into a reality. Construction began in 1964, transforming the Montreal waterfront into a heavily engineered laboratory. For efficiency, the team built a massive prefabrication factory directly on the construction site, and the building process operated like a giant assembly line. First, workers poured concrete into massive steel molds to cast individual modules measuring roughly 38 feet long, 17 feet wide, by 10 feet high. Once dry, these massive 90-ton concrete boxes were placed onto a conveyor belt system. As the boxes moved through the outdoor facility, teams fitted them with windows, insulation, electrical wiring, and climate control. They even installed pre-built fiberglass bathrooms and kitchens before the box ever left the ground. Once a module was complete, a giant crane hoisted the 90-ton block into the air and precisely placed it onto the growing structure. The boxes were then tied together using a network of high-strength steel cables and heavy bolts. creating a unified, load-bearing grid. When Expo 67 opened its gates in April of 1967, Habitat 67 became something of a global sensation. Over the course of 6 months, millions of visitors flocked to the fair, and Habitat 67 stood as the undisputed icon of the future. Heads of state, international dignitaries, and Hollywood celebrities toured the complex, marveling at how a building made of cold, heavy concrete could feel so light, airy, and alive. Many witnesses recalled how walking through Habitat 67 felt like exploring a vertical village. Elevators did not open into dark indoor hallways. Instead, they stopped at every 4th floor, opening onto wide, uncovered walkways the architect called a pedestrian street in the sky. With that, it was praised internationally as a fantastic experiment that successfully redefined urban living. But as the euphoria of the World's Fair began to fade, the harsh realities of economics, politics, and physics caught up with the idea. The economic math behind the assembly line was the first thing to fall apart under scrutiny. You see, mass prefabrication only works to reduce costs if you build thousands of units, allowing the massive upfront expenses of factories and specialized machinery to be spread out. And to be fair, the original master plan envisioned a sprawling community of 1,200 residential units, complete with built-in schools, shops, and offices. So, as a concept on paper, the scale was there. However, terrified by the escalating cost, the federal government cut the funding, shrinking the project down to just 158 apartments. So weirdly, without scale, the expense of things like on-site factories, cranes, and so on couldn't be justified. The resulting cost overruns were staggering. The final price tag skyrocketed to 12.4 million Canadian dollars. And remember, this was back in 1967, so it amounted to an astronomical cost per unit. Accordingly, when the government began renting these apartments out in '68, they had to set the rent at an exorbitant $1,000 per unit just to try and get their money back, which was a devastating blow to the project's goal. It meant that, ironically, the very people the design was conceived for, everyday working families, were completely priced out. Think about that. Habitat 67 had intended to democratize urban housing, but instead, it instantly became an accidental enclave for the wealthy. Furthermore, the building's geometric architecture quickly proved to be a structural nightmare in the cold climate. In a standard apartment building, one unit's floor is insulated by the apartment below it, with its ceiling sheltered by the apartment above. But in the case of Habitat 67's staggered design, every single concrete box is highly exposed to the elements. To make matters worse, as Montreal's winters cycled between freezing and thawing, water found its way into the hundreds of exposed joints and concrete seams. Moisture seeped deep into the structural walls, leading to water damage, concrete cracking, and several mold problems that spread throughout the shared ventilation system. The automatic watering systems meant to keep the terrace gardens green also leaked constantly, which just compounded the damage. In other words, this building was too expensive to help normal families have a place to live, and it meant that urban city dwellers really couldn't all have a garden. In the end, many people felt that this entire project, as cool as it was, turned out to be a disaster. By the mid-1980s, the government decided to rid itself of the financial burden, selling the complex to a private businessman who eventually sold it to a group of the building's own tenants for $11.4 million. In turn, the residents formed a private housing co-op. The units that were supposed to be a blueprint for affordable public housing now command a multi-million-dollar price tag on a private real estate market. Its residents are typically corporate executives and wealthy design purists who can afford the steep fees required to keep the concrete structurally sound. Yet, despite its economic failure, Habitat 67's legacy is an artistic success story. It changed how the world thinks about high-density urban design. Decades before terms like green architecture or sustainability became mainstream, a 23-year-old student physically built those exact concepts into concrete. The only problem was, it didn't work. Even so, his career was launched into stardom thanks to the project. And over the next 60 years, he took the lessons that he learned with Habitat 67 and deployed them across the globe, establishing massive modular developments across Asia. So that's the story of Habitat 67. A special thanks to the viewer who submitted this idea. If any of you out there have an interesting topic we should cover, you can use the form in the description below to send it in, and I'll likely make it. Otherwise, I'd be curious to hear your thoughts on today's video. And as always, this is Ryan Socash, signing off.